The letter that sealed Alara's fate arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a final notice for the electricity bill and a grocery store flyer offering 2-for-1 on canned soup. It was thin, anemic, the kind of envelope that carried only bad news. Inside, the legalese was a thicket of thorns, but the meaning was brutally clear. Her great-aunt Millie's estate, the last frayed thread connecting her to a family that had long considered her an afterthought, had been settled. Her cousins and her uncle Marcus, whose voice was always slick with the oil of condescending pity, had liquidated the assets. The farmhouse, the land, the stocks her great-aunt had so carefully accumulated. All of it sold, divided, absorbed into lives already padded with comfort. For Alara, there was a single-dollar bill, folded crisply around a rust-stained key, and a deed. The deed was for a useless patch of land miles from anything, a place the family had called Seraphina's Folly. On it stood a crumbling stone windmill, a monument to decay that hadn't turned in 100 years. They had sold a legacy and left her the ghost. If you're just joining us, make sure to subscribe to see how this story unfolds, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from in the world. The weight of the key in her palm was heavier than the single dollar it was wrapped in. It felt like the anchor to a ship that had already sunk. Betrayal wasn't a sharp enough word. It was an erasure. Her uncle Marcus had handled it all. His signature a self-satisfied flourish at the bottom of the letter. He had called her once, his voice oozing a practiced sympathy that didn't quite cover the smugness beneath. "It's for the best, Alara," he'd said. "Millie's affairs were a mess. We tidied things up. That old mill, well, we thought you might appreciate the sentiment of it. Your great-grandmother Seraphina built it, you know. Piece of history, just for you, a piece of history. A pile of stones held together by ivy and inertia. It was a joke, and the punchline was her life. Her life with her 7-year-old son, Leo, in a cramped apartment where the walls seemed to sweat with the humidity of their quiet desperation. Her life working double shifts at the diner, the smell of grease clinging to her clothes like a second skin, her hands raw from hot water and harsh soap. This inheritance wasn't a gift. It was a meticulously crafted insult, a final, definitive severing. They had given her a symbol of her own brokenness, a crumbling structure on forgotten land, and they had paid her $1 for the trouble of taking it off their hands. The drive out to the property was a silent pilgrimage into the heart of that insult. Leo sat in the passenger seat of her sputtering 20-year-old car, his small face pressed against the window, watching the city bleed into tired suburbs and then into the sparse, windswept countryside. He didn't understand the nuances of the betrayal, the cold calculus of family greed. He just knew they were going to see a castle. "Is it a real castle, Mom?" he asked, his voice a small, hopeful note in the oppressive quiet of the car. "It's old, sweetie," Alara managed, her throat tight. Like a castle, the word tasted like ash in her mouth. When they finally found the dirt road, barely more than 2 ruts in the earth, the windmill appeared on the horizon, a jagged tooth against a pale, unforgiving sky. It was worse than she had imagined. The stone was dark, stained with decades of rain and neglect. The wooden blades were gone, save for a few splintered spars that pointed at the sky like broken fingers. The roof was a concave wound, open to the elements. It didn't look like a piece of history. It looked like a tombstone. They parked, and the wind immediately whipped at them, a mournful, ceaseless sound that seemed to flow through the broken windows of the mill. Leo, his castle fantasy dissolving in the face of grim reality, clung to her hand. The air smelled of damp earth, of decay, of time itself. Alara stood before the massive, iron-strapped wooden door, the rusted key feeling cold and alien in her hand. This was it. This was the sum total of her legacy. $1 and a ruin. She thought of Marcus, pictured him in his climate-controlled office, signing papers that would add another layer of comfort to his already seamless life. He had probably laughed when he signed the deed over to her. A final, perfect gesture to put the poor relation in her place. The key grated in the lock, the sound of metal screaming against rust. With a shuddering groan, the heavy door swung inward, releasing a breath of air that was cold and musty, thick with the dust of a forgotten century. Inside, the gloom was almost absolute. Thin shafts of light cut through the grime-caked windows and holes in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust. The ground floor was a vast, circular space, dominated by the colossal machinery of the mill. Gears the size of tables were frozen with rust, their teeth locked in a final, silent embrace. Ropes, as thick as her arm, hung like petrified snakes from the shadowy ceiling. And in the center of it all, rising from the stone floor like an altar, was the millstone. It was a perfect circle of granite, wider than she was tall, and at its heart sat its companion, the runner stone, slightly smaller and darker. They were immense, immovable, the dead heart of the dead machine. Alara felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her knees. What was she supposed to do with this? Sell it for scrap? The cost of hauling the metal away would be more than it was worth. The stones were worthless. The land was worthless. Her uncle had been thorough. He hadn't just given her nothing. He had given her a burden, a physical manifestation of her own powerlessness. Leo, however, seemed to have found a new kind of wonder. He let go of her hand and walked slowly into the center of the room, his small form dwarfed by the scale of the machinery. He ran a hand over the cold, rough surface of the millstone. "It's sleeping," he whispered, his voice echoing in the vast, silent space. Alara watched him, a familiar ache tightening her chest. She had to be strong for him. She had to find a way forward, even when every path seemed to be a dead end. She took a deep breath, the dusty air scratching at her lungs. She would clean it. She would sweep the floors, wash the windows, see what was really here. It was a pointless, absurd task, but it was something. It was an act of defiance against the crushing weight of the insult. It was a way to tell the ghost of her uncle, and the whole indifferent world, that she was still here. She was still standing. She would not be ground down. Not yet. Alara started with a broom she'd brought from the apartment, a flimsy thing of plastic and straw that felt laughably inadequate for the task. The floor was a carpet of debris. A century's worth of dust, fallen plaster, desiccated leaves, and the tiny bones of birds and mice that had sought shelter and found their final rest. Each sweep of the broom raised a choking cloud, a ghostly exhalation from the mill's stone lungs. The light from the door cut a bright, hazy path through the gloom, and in its beam, the dust danced like frantic, microscopic spirits. Leo, bundled in his coat, appointed himself the keeper of a small pile of interesting stones he found near the wall, occasionally looking up to watch his mother as she waged her silent, futile war against the decay. The work was mindless, repetitive, and for that Alara was grateful. It allowed her mind to drift away from the sharp edges of her anger and despair, to settle into a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the soreness in her back and shoulders. As she worked her way toward the center of the room, toward the colossal millstone, the sheer physicality of the structure began to impress itself upon her. This wasn't just a pile of rocks. It had been built. Hand-hewn timbers, thick as a man's waist, supported the upper floors. The stones were fitted together with a precision that spoke of incredible labor and skill. Her great-grandmother, Serafina, the woman was a whisper in the family history, an eccentric who had squandered a small fortune on this folly, and then disappeared into obscurity. A cautionare tale. But standing here, in the cold, dusty heart of her creation, Alara felt a flicker of something else. Not madness, purpose. What kind of purpose required a fortress like this, built to withstand a siege of time itself? She reached the base of the millstone, the stationary bedstone, and knelt, her broom forgotten. The granite was cold to the touch, its surface surprisingly smooth beneath the layer of grime. It was a single, solid piece of rock, a foundation set into the very earth. Her eyes traced its circumference, following the line where it met the stone floor. And then she saw it. It wasn't a crack or a seam, not really. It was more like an interruption in the texture of the stone. A line so fine it was almost invisible, as if a single thread had been laid across the granite before it hardened. It was perfect, too perfect to be natural. Her fingers, calloused from work, traced the line. It was utterly seamless, yet undeniably there. A perfect, inscribed circle near the outer edge of the massive stone. Curiosity, an emotion she hadn't felt in what seemed like years, began to stir beneath the weariness. She followed the line around the stone's vast perimeter until she found another anomaly. A small, circular indentation, no bigger than a quarter, filled with what looked like hardened rust. It looked like a keyhole, but not for any key she had ever seen. It was a small, dark void in the face of the stone. She pressed her finger into it, scraping away the rust and dirt. Beneath there was metal. She stood up, her heart beginning to beat a little faster, a frantic bird in the cage of her ribs. She circled the stone again, her eyes scanning not just the surface now, but the entire structure. The runner stone sat atop the bedstone, the massive piece that would have turned to grind the grain. There was a hand-cranked iron winch nearby, its chain thick with rust, likely used to lift the runner stone for maintenance. But that wasn't what caught her eye. Bolted to the floor, almost hidden in the shadows at the base of the bedstone, was a small iron lever, no longer than her forearm. It was so corroded and caked with grime that it seemed to be a part of the floor itself. It looked like it hadn't been moved since the day it was forged. Elara knelt beside it, her knees protesting on the cold stone. She wrapped her hands around the lever. It was frigid, unyielding. She pulled. Nothing. It was frozen solid. The mill was silent save for the ceaseless moan of the wind outside and the sound of her own ragged breathing. "What is it, Mom?" Leo asked, abandoning his rock collection to come stand beside her. "I don't know, baby," she breathed, her eyes fixed on the lever. She repositioned herself, planting her feet, using her whole body. She pulled again, a low grunt escaping her lips. The metal groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate up from the earth, through the stone, and into her bones. A hairline crack appeared in the rust around the lever's base. It had moved, barely a millimeter, but it had moved. A surge of adrenaline, sharp and clean, cut through her fatigue. She pulled again, harder this time, her muscles screaming in protest. Another groan, louder, deeper. The lever shifted, then scraped, then moved a full inch, the sound of grinding rust echoing in the cavernous space. Suddenly, with a deafening crack, it gave way, swinging freely in a short arc before locking into a new position with a solid metallic thud. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence rushed back in, deeper than before. The dust settled. The wind howled. Elara stayed crouched on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath held tight in her chest. And then she heard it. A low, deep vibration. It wasn't a sound she heard with her ears, but one she felt in her teeth, in the soles of her feet. It was the sound of something immense and heavy shifting. Her eyes shot to the millstone. The fine, almost invisible line she had discovered was no longer seamless. A gap had appeared, a dark void no thicker than a blade of grass, and it was widening. Slowly, with an inexorable, grinding slowness, a massive section of the millstone, a perfect circular plug, was descending into the floor. The mechanism was silent, a testament to an engineering that defied the decay all around it. The stone lowered itself without a shudder, sinking into a hidden cavity in the foundation until its top was flush with the surrounding floor. Where the center of the millstone had been, there was now a dark, circular opening, a newly revealed well leading down into the earth. The air that rose from it was cold and sterile, smelling not of damp earth but of dry, contained space. Leo gasped, his small hand gripping her arm. Elara couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was staring into a secret. Her uncle had given her a ruin, a joke, a symbol of her worthlessness. But her great-grandmother, the eccentric, the madwoman, the cautionary tale, she had given her a key. Elara peered over the edge. It wasn't a deep well. A short, stone-lined shaft descended about 10 feet. At the bottom, nestled perfectly within the foundation of the mill, was a thick, steel door, its surface untarnished by time. In its center was a single, complex-looking wheel, like the hatch of a submarine. This wasn't a cellar. It was a vault. The site of the vault door, clean and precise in its subterranean chamber, was so incongruous with the decay and ruin of the mill around it that it felt like a hallucination. The air itself seemed to thin, the silence becoming a physical pressure against Alara's eardrums. Leo clung to her, his earlier curiosity replaced by a primal awe that bordered on fear. This was no longer a game. The sleeping thing in the heart of the mill was awake. Alara's mind struggled to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. A vault hidden inside a millstone, on a worthless piece of land, left to her for $1. A place no one would ever look, protected by its own apparent worthlessness. It was the kind of secret found in adventure novels, not in the grim, paycheck-to-paycheck reality of her life. She found an old wooden ladder, its rungs slick with moss, and carefully lowered it into the opening. Every movement felt momentous, every sound amplified in the charged silence. She told Leo to stay put, to not come near the edge, and her voice was a strained whisper that he obeyed without question. Climbing down, her hands trembling, she felt a distinct shift in the atmosphere. The air in the shaft was colder, stiller, devoid of the scent of dust and damp that permeated the mill above. It was the preserved air of a sealed place. She reached the bottom and stood before the steel door. It was a masterpiece of engineering. It seems perfect, the metal cool and smooth under her tentative touch. The wheel in the center was not rusted. It was pristine, as if it had been installed yesterday. There was no keyhole. She ran her hands over its surface, searching for a clue, a latch, a hidden button. Her fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible inscription etched into the metal just below the wheel. She had to lean in close, using the faint light from her phone to read the elegant script. What grinds, what is ground, and what remains, it was a riddle, a code. She thought of the mill of the two great stones, one turning, one stationary. She thought of the grain transformed between them. What grinds, the runner stone. What is ground, the grain. What remains, the flour, the foundation. The foundation. Her eyes darted around the small, circular chamber. The walls were smooth, fitted stone, but directly opposite the vault door, set into the wall at eye level, was a single stone brick that was a slightly different color, a shade darker than the rest. She pushed against it. It didn't move. She examined it more closely. Like the millstone above, it had a hairline seam around it. It wasn't a brick. It was a drawer, but there was no handle. She thought back to the top floor of the mill, to the small, rusted indentation on the bedstone. The one that looked like a strange keyhole. She remembered the key in her pocket, the one that had opened the front door. On a hunch, she pulled it out. It was a simple, old-fashioned skeleton key, its shaft thick with rust. The head of the key, however, was unusual. It wasn't a simple loop but a small, solid piece of iron shaped like a gear with 6 teeth. She climbed back up the ladder, her mind racing. She went to the millstone and found the indentation. She scraped out the remaining debris and pushed the head of the key into the opening. It was a perfect fit. The 6 teeth of the gear-shaped key head meshed with a mechanism hidden within the stone. She turned it. There was a soft click from deep within the stone, and then another, louder thud from below. She scrambled back down the ladder. The stone drawer in the wall was now jutting out by an inch. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a key, but a single, heavy, beautifully machined metal dial. It was a combination lock dial, but unattached to any door. She lifted it. It was heavy, solid brass. She took it to the vault door and saw a matching circular receptacle just to the right of the main wheel. The dial clicked into place with satisfying precision. Now came the impossible part. The combination. What grinds, what is ground, and what remains, it wasn't just a riddle. It was an instruction. She thought about Serafina, the woman who built this place. The numbers would have to mean something to her. Alara's own birthday? No. The year the mill was built? She didn't know it. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind, trying to think like someone hiding a secret. The phrase repeated, a mantra. What grinds? The turning stone. The runner. What is ground? The seed. The beginning. What remains? The foundation. The bedstone. Numbers. She needed numbers. She looked at the dial. It was numbered 0 to 99. 3 numbers. A memory surfaced. A story her great-aunt Millie had told her once, years ago, about the family Bible. A huge, leather-bound book with births and deaths recorded in spidery ink. Millie had mentioned that Serafina had been obsessed with it, not for the religion, but for the arithmetic of lives. On another hunch, she climbed out of the shaft again. She had brought a small box of Millie's personal effects with her, things her uncle hadn't bothered to sell. Inside, beneath yellowed photographs and dried flowers, was the small, worn leather Bible. She opened it to the front pages. There they were, the family records. Serafina's birth year, 1881. The year she laid the foundation for the mill, 1908. The year she had her only child, Alara's grandmother, 1912. The numbers felt significant, but how did they fit the riddle? What grinds? The turning stone, the cycle of life, her birth, 81. What is ground? The seed, her child, 12. What remains? The foundation, the mill itself, 08. It was a long shot, a wild guess based on a half-remembered story and a cryptic phrase. But it was all she had. Back down in the cold, silent chamber, she stood before the vault. Her fingers were numb, not just from the cold, but from a trembling that had taken root deep inside her. She spun the dial, right to 81, left past 81 to 12, right to 8. A heavy, resonant click echoed in the small space. It was the sound of tumblers falling into place. Her heart stopped. She laid her hands on the central wheel. It was no longer locked. She turned it. With the smoothness of a well-oiled machine, the massive locking bolts retracted. She pulled the door. It swung open without a sound, revealing a small, walk-in space, a room lined not with gold or jewels, but with shelves. And on the shelves were dozens of leather-bound ledgers and stacks upon stacks of documents, all tied neatly with string. It was an archive, a library of secrets. On a small wooden pedestal in the center of the vault sat a single, sealed envelope. On it, in the same elegant script, was one word, Alara, her name. It was a letter from the past, a message from a ghost. She picked it up, her fingers leaving imprints in the faint dust on the envelope. She opened it. The letter was short, the ink faded but clear. My dearest Alara, it began. I do not know the woman you will become, but I know the blood that runs in you. I leave you not a treasure, but a burden, a tool. Wealth is not a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be carried. It is a force, like the wind that turns the stones. What it builds or what it grinds to dust depends entirely on the hand that guides it. Be the hand that builds. The ledgers hold the truth. The bonds hold the power. Do not trust the blood that betrayed you. Trust the foundation. Your loving great-grandmother, Serafina. Beneath the letter was a single sheet of paper, a summary of assets dated decades ago. Stock certificates in companies that had become giants. Bearer bonds from a time when such things were anonymous and untraceable. Land deeds. The numbers swam before Alara's eyes, a meaningless string of zeros until her mind finally, painfully, assembled them into a coherent figure. $329 million. The air rushed from her lungs. She stumbled back, hitting the stone wall, the letter crinkling in her fist. This wasn't a fortune. It was a weight, a crushing, terrifying weight. In the ruins of her life, her great-grandmother had just laid a foundation of impossible gravity, and Alara was standing right in the center of it. The drive back to the city was a blur of unreality. The staggering number, $329,000,000, repeated itself in Alara's mind, a silent, screaming mantra that drowned out the rattle of her old car and the quiet questions from Leo in the passenger seat. He knew something profound had happened. He had felt the shift in the mill's deep silence, had seen the look on his mother's face as she emerged from the earth, pale and trembling, clutching a stack of yellowed papers as if they were the only thing anchoring her to the ground. She had taken only a few of the bonds and the single summary sheet, along with Serafina's letter. The rest she had sealed back inside the vault. The grinding sound of the millstone closing over the secret once more feeling like a final, irrevocable punctuation mark on the life she had known before. Back in their cramped apartment, the world she had left that morning felt alien. The peeling paint, the dripping faucet, the stack of overdue bills on the counter. They were artifacts from another existence. She was sitting on a treasure that could erase all of this, that could buy her a new life, a new world. But Serafina's words echoed with the weight of prophecy. Not a treasure, but a burden. The money didn't feel like a blessing, felt like a threat. It was a secret so large it seemed to suck the very air out of the room. Who could she tell? Who could she trust? Certainly not her family. Serafina's warning, "Do not trust the blood that betrayed you," was sharp and clear. Her Uncle Marcus would gut her for a fraction of this. The police? The government? They would ask questions she couldn't answer, questions about where this money had been for the better part of a century, how it had been acquired, why it was hidden in cash-equivalent bonds in the ground. It was a legal minefield she was utterly unequipped to navigate. She needed help. Not just any help. She needed someone wise, someone discreet, someone who understood the way the world worked in the quiet, carpeted offices where fortunes like this were dissected and devoured. The next day, after dropping Leo at school, she went to the legal aid office, the same place that had given her advice on her eviction notice last year. She asked for the oldest, most experienced lawyer they had for a consultation. They sent her to a small, dusty office in the back of the building, a room overflowing with books and files that seemed to be holding the walls up. Behind the desk sat Mr. Alistair Finch. He was a man who looked as though he were woven from the same dust and paper that filled his office. He was tall and stooped, with a shock of white hair and eyes that were a pale, watery blue, but sharp and intelligent. He had a reputation for taking on impossible cases, for tilting at the windmills of corporate law, mostly pro bono. He was semi-retired, taking only the cases that interested him. Alara sat before him, her hands clenched around her purse strap. She didn't know where to begin. "Mr. Finch," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "I have a complicated inheritance." He listened patiently, his expression unchanging, as she recounted the story of the family betrayal, the dollar, the crumbling mill. He nodded slowly, a familiar tale of familial greed. It was when she mentioned the millstone that his posture shifted slightly, a flicker of interest in his pale eyes. "And you found something," he stated, not a question. Alara took a deep breath. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single document, one of the bearer bonds. It was for $100,000, issued by a railroad company in the 1920s. She pushed it across the desk. Mr. Finch picked it up with the careful, delicate touch of a historian handling a fragile manuscript. He held it up to the light from his desk lamp, his eyes scanning the intricate engraving, the watermarks, the signatures. He was silent for a long, long time. The only sound in the room was the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. He lowered the bond and placed it gently on the desk. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her, for the first time. The professional distance was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, weary gravity. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, his voice low and serious, "where did you get this?" "There are more," she whispered. "A lot more." "How much more?" She told him the number. 329 million. The words felt obscene in the dusty little office. Mr. Finch didn't gasp. He didn't exclaim. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the impact of a physical blow. He opened them again, and his gaze was unsettlingly direct. "You need to understand what you have," he said, his voice stripped of all pleasantries. "This is not money, not in the way you think of it. This is power. It is history. A fortune of this size, hidden for this long, in this form. It doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It has a past, a story. And I assure you, that story is not a simple 1 inch." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "This kind of wealth has gravity. It bends things toward it. People, organizations, creates its own weather system. You have just walked into the heart of a hurricane, and you don't even see the clouds gathering yet." His words sent a chill down her spine. This was the fear she couldn't articulate, the sense of a looming, unseen threat. "Bearer bonds of this age," he continued, tapping the document with a long, thin finger, "are financial ghosts. They are anonymous, payable to whoever holds them. They are a nightmare for tax agencies and a dream for anyone wanting to hide wealth. Liquidating them, bringing this fortune into the modern world, will be like setting off a flare in the dead of night. Everyone will see it. Everyone will want to know where it came from. And everyone who thinks they have even the slightest claim to it will come for you." "Claim?" Alara asked, her voice tight. "My great-grandmother left it to me." "Did she?" he countered gently. "Or did she leave you a windmill where you happened to find it? The law makes a very fine distinction. Your uncle, your cousins, they sold you the property, not its hidden contents. They will argue that it was a mistake, a clerical error, that they are the rightful heirs to this fortune. They will sue you. They will drag your name through the mud. They will try to prove you are incompetent, a cheat, a thief. They will try to take your son away from you to prove you are an unfit mother. They will stop at nothing." The room suddenly felt very cold. The weight of Serafina's burden was becoming terrifyingly real. "What do I do?" she asked, the question a plea. Mr. Finch looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and something else, a kind of weary respect. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the steel beneath it. "The first thing you do," he said, "is you tell no one, not a soul. You go back to your life. You go to work. You pay your bills as you always have. You are poor. You are struggling. That is your shield. For now, it is your only shield." He picked up the bond again. "And the second thing you do is you and I are going to read those ledgers your great-grandmother left. Every single page. Because this money has a name, Alara. It has a history. And before we fight the monsters this fortune will inevitably attract, we need to know for certain whether we are standing on the side of the angels." The ledgers were the true treasure and the true curse. Bound in dark, cracked leather, their pages were filled with Serafina's meticulous, elegant script. They were not just financial records. They were a diary, a confession, a roadmap of a hidden life. For weeks, Alara's world shrank to the confines of Mr. Finch's dusty office. By day, she served coffee and cleared tables at the diner. The mundane routine a bizarre counterpoint to the secret history she was unearthing by night. She would put Leo to bed, his sleeping form a constant, tangible reminder of what she was fighting for, and then drive to the old brick building where Mr. Finch would be waiting, a pot of stale coffee brewing on a hot plate. Together, they descended into the past. Serafina's story unfolded, not in grand pronouncements, but in the cold, hard numbers of her transactions. She was a ghost in the machine of early 20th century capitalism. Using a series of pseudonyms and shell corporations, she had played the markets with a genius that was both terrifying and brilliant. She bought railroad stock before a boom, invested in fledgling industrial technologies years before they became ubiquitous, and quietly acquired land in the path of inevitable urban expansion. She was a visionary, a financial prophet who saw the future in stock tickers and commodity prices. The bulk of the fortune, the clean, undeniable majority of it, was the result of her incredible acumen. But it was the beginning that troubled them. The seed. Every great tree grows from a single seed, and the seed of Serafina's fortune was planted in tainted soil. The first ledger, dated decades before the others, detailed a single complex transaction. It wasn't her own. It belonged to her husband, a man the family history had conveniently forgotten. He had been a land speculator, a partner in a firm that had acquired a large tract of rural land, home to a thriving, self-sufficient community of black farmers. The firm had used a series of legally dubious tactics, predatory loans, challenges to land titles, and political intimidation, to force the families out, acquiring the land for a pittance. They then sold it to a railroad developer for a massive profit. That profit was the seed money. Serafina's husband died shortly after, leaving her a young widow with a fortune built on the displacement of her own people. The ledger recorded it all in cold, dispassionate detail. There were no words of guilt or remorse, only columns of numbers. But after that entry, the nature of the records changed. Serafina's own transactions began, and with them a new pattern. She had spent the rest of her life not just growing the money, but tracking it, transforming it, cleaning it through 1,000 different channels, as if trying to wash the stain of its origin away through sheer financial alchemy. She wasn't just investing, Mr. Finch murmured one night, his finger tracing a line of script. She was running from this first sin. She spent 50 years trying to outrun the ghost of this money. The discovery settled a new kind of weight on Alara. Before, the fear had been external, the threat of her family, of legal challenges. Now it was internal. A moral signis. Could she, in good conscience, claim a fortune that had its roots in such a profound injustice? To take this money would be to build her own future, and Leo's, on a foundation of other people's stolen pasts. Serafina's words came back to her. What it builds or what it grinds to dust depends entirely on the hand that guides it. Was it possible to build something good from something so corrupt? Could this tool, forged in sin, be used for redemption? The moral dilemma gnawed at her, poisoning the relief the money might have offered. It was no longer a simple matter of survival. It was a question of her soul. As if summoned by her turmoil, her uncle Marcus called. His voice was the same as it had always been, a smooth, condescending baritone that made her feel small. Alara, just calling to check in. He began, the feigned concern thick in his voice. Settling in with your inheritance? It's a lot to take in, Marcus, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I'm sure. Look, I know things are tight for you. A friend of mine is in real estate, specializes in historic properties. He might be willing to take that pile of rocks off your hands for a few thousand. For the land, might help you and the boy get back on your feet, a few $1,000s. He was offering her crumbs from a table she now knew he had stolen. The casual, dismissive cruelty of it, the way he saw her as nothing more than a problem to be managed with a pittance, ignited a cold, hard flame in her chest. For the first time, she wasn't intimidated by him. She was looking at him from across a vast, secret chasm, and from her side he looked small, petty, blind. Thank you for the offer, Marcus, she said, the words tasting like metal. But I think I'll hold on to it for a while. For the sentiment, there was a pause on the other end of the line. A flicker of surprise, maybe even annoyance, in the silence. He had expected gratitude, a desperate acceptance. He wasn't used to being refused, especially not by her. Suit yourself, he finally said, his tone clipped, the false warmth gone. Don't say I never tried to help, he hung up. The call was a catalyst. His casual greed, his utter ignorance of the truth, clarified things for Alara. Marcus and the rest of the family represented the original sin of the money, the taking without thought, the profiting from pain. They were the ones who would have taken this fortune and padded their own comfortable lives, never once questioning its origin, never once feeling the weight of the injustice that created it. They were the ones who would let it continue to be a curse. She looked at Mr. Finch, her eyes clear and resolute. I can't be like him, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I won't be. This money, it has a debt to pay. Serafina knew it. That's why she hid it. She wasn't just hiding the money. She was protecting it. Waiting for someone who would understand, Mr. Finch nodded slowly, a deep, weary understanding in his eyes. I believe you're right, he said. But be warned, Alara. The moment we try to use this money for anything other than personal enrichment, we will create enemies. Powerful enemies. The world is built on old injustices. Try to correct one, and the entire structure will try to crush you. The moral temptation, to take the money and run, to forget the ledger and build a new life for herself and Leo, was still there, a seductive whisper in the back of her mind. But now it was fainter, quieter, overpowered by a new, emerging sense of purpose. She was not just the inheritor of a fortune. She was the inheritor of a debt, and for the first time she felt strong enough to even consider paying it. The first tremor of the coming earthquake arrived not as a lawsuit or a threatening phone call, but as a piece of thick, cream-colored stationery delivered by a courier. It was addressed not to Alara Jackson, but to a legal fiction, the custodian of the Millstone Trust, care of the property at 417 Old Creek Road. The name alone, Millstone Trust, sent a jolt of ice through Alara's veins. Someone knew, or at least they suspected. The letter was from a law firm whose name was a string of patrician surnames, Blackwood, Thorne, and Associates, a name that reeked of old money and unassailable power. The language was exquisitely polite, a masterpiece of veiled threat. It stated that their client, the Northeastern Historical Preservation Foundation, had recently uncovered a covenant in the original deed to the land upon which the windmill stood. The covenant, they claimed, stipulated that any and all historical artifacts or contents of significant value discovered on the property were to be turned over to the Foundation for Preservation and Study. They requested a meeting to arrange a peaceful and amicable transfer of any such items. "It's a fishing expedition," Mr. Finch said, holding the letter up to the light in his office as if he could divine the truth in its watermark. "They don't know what's there, but they know something is. A covenant like this is rare, but not unheard of. It's usually meant to cover arrowheads and old farm tools. Not." He trailed off, gesturing to the copy of Serafina's asset summary on his desk. "This foundation?" Alara asked, her voice tense. "Are they legitimate?" Mr. Finch was already typing on his ancient computer, the keys clicking loudly in the quiet room. "Oh, they're legitimate," he muttered after a few moments. "Massive endowment. Board of directors reads like a who's who of the corporate and banking world. They buy up historic properties all over the state. But their acquisitions history is aggressive," he pointed to the screen. "They have a reputation for using legal battles to drain the resources of small landowners, forcing them to sell for pennies on the dollar. They're not preservationists, Alara. They're predators, using history as a cloak." The connection was chillingly obvious. "They're connected to the original land deal," Alara breathed. "To the families that were displaced." "It's possible," Mr. Finch conceded. "Or they're connected to the railroad or the developers. A fortune this large leaves echoes, ripples in time. Someone in that organization has a piece of the story. A rumor, a notation in an old file, and they've been waiting, maybe for generations, for the property to change hands. The faceless, powerful institution was the first monster rising from the depths. They represented a systemic greed, a patient, corporate avarice that could wait a century for its prize." Alara felt a surge of claustrophobic panic. She was a single mother who bought her son's shoes at a thrift store. How could she possibly fight a legal Goliath like Blackwood, Thorne, and Associates? The windmill, once a symbol of her family's insulting charity, had transformed again. It was no longer just a hiding place. It was a fortress, and she was its lone defender. She had to protect Serafina's secret, not just for herself, but for the purpose she was beginning to understand it was meant for. The world, however, seemed to be conspiring to shrink around her. The pressure was no longer abstract. It had a name and a letterhead. She started seeing things, or perhaps just noticing them for the first time. A dark sedan parked across the street from her apartment building for a whole afternoon. A man in a suit at the diner who ordered only a cup of coffee and read a newspaper for 2 hours, his eyes occasionally flicking toward her. It could have been paranoia, her mind playing tricks on her under the immense strain. But it felt real. She felt watched. Mr. Finch advised caution. They drafted a polite but firm response to the law firm, stating that she was the legal owner of the property and its contents, and that no such artifacts of significant value had been found. It was a lie, a carefully worded legal shield, but they both knew it wouldn't hold them off for long. It was a stall, a way to buy time. But time for what? They were still deciphering the ledgers, still trying to grasp the full scope of Serafina's plans. The pressure was forcing them to move faster than they were ready. The feeling of being ground down, the central metaphor of the mill, was no longer just a feeling. It was a strategy being actively deployed against her. They would bury her in motions, in discovery requests, in legal fees she couldn't possibly pay. They would bleed her dry until she had no choice but to surrender the key to the vault. The contrast between her life and the forces arrayed against her was a chasm. That evening, she helped Leo with his math homework at their small, wobbly kitchen table. The problem involved calculating the cost of groceries. As she explained the simple arithmetic of apples and oranges, her mind was grappling with the impossible calculus of a 9-figure fortune and the predators circling it. The sheer absurdity of her situation was overwhelming. She was living in two worlds simultaneously: the world of overdue bills and school lunches, and the world of hidden vaults and corporate sharks. And the membrane between those two worlds was growing thinner every day. She looked at her son, his brow furrowed in concentration over a simple word problem, and a wave of fierce, protective resolve washed over her. She would not let them win. She would not let them take this chance, this one impossible chance to rewrite the story of their lives, to pay the debts of the past. Serafina had waited for a hand that would build. Alara clenched her own, the knuckles white. She would not let that hand be crushed. She would become the stone herself, unmoving and unbreakable. The fight was no longer just about money or legacy. It was about survival and the quiet, desperate hope for a justice that had been denied for far too long. The predators had shown their teeth, and now she knew the name of her enemy. But she was about to discover another, far closer to home. The letter from Blackwood, Thorne and Associates had an effect Alara and Mr. Finch had not anticipated. It acted like a drop of blood in waters infested with sharks. While the historical foundation was a patient corporate predator, another was far more impulsive, driven by a more personal and venomous greed. Her uncle Marcus, through the incestuous grapevine of high-powered law firms and country club memberships, Marcus heard about the legal inquiry into his niece's worthless property. A firm like Blackwood, Thorne and Associates didn't get involved over rusty farm equipment. Their presence meant one thing: value. Significant value. He had given her the mill as an insult, a clever way to be seen as charitable while simultaneously reminding her of her place. The thought that he had accidentally handed her a winning lottery ticket was an intolerable, burning coal in his gut. He arrived at her apartment unannounced. The sight of his polished silver luxury car parked at the curb of her rundown building was an alien intrusion. A spaceship landed in a junkyard. When she opened the door, he was standing there, his expensive suit looking out of place against her peeling paint, a cellophane-wrapped bouquet of flowers in his hand as a transparently false offering of peace. "Alara," he said, his voice a rich, syrupy blend of concern and bonhomie. "I was in the neighborhood. I wanted to see how you and Leo were doing." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes sweeping across her small, tidy apartment, his expression a carefully managed mask of sympathy that didn't quite hide his distaste. He was taking inventory of her poverty, confirming for himself that she was still the person he thought she was, helpless, struggling, and in need of his magnanimous guidance. "I heard you've had some legal interest in the old mill," he said, setting the flowers on her cluttered counter. "A historical society, I believe? These people can be very aggressive, Alara. They prey on people who don't have the resources to fight back." He sat at her wobbly kitchen table as if it were a throne, his presence sucking the air out of the room. "I'm worried about you," he continued, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial tone. "You and the boy. A legal battle. It's draining. Financially, emotionally. You're not equipped to handle a firm like that." Alara stood by the sink, her arms crossed, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She said nothing. She let him talk, let him spin his web. She was no longer the timid niece who flinched at his condescending tone. The secrets she carried were in armor, and through its visor, she saw him with perfect, chilling clarity. "Here's what I'm proposing," he said, steepling his fingers. "As the executor of Millie's estate, I feel a certain responsibility. It's clear we undervalued the property. A clerical oversight. Sign the deed back over to the family estate. My legal team, the best in the city, will handle this foundation nonsense. And to compensate you for your trouble, we'll give you a generous settlement. Say $50,000? Clean. No fuss. Enough to get you and Leo a fresh start. A down payment on a nice little house somewhere, $50,000. The number was an insult, but it was also a revelation. He didn't know the true amount. He was still guessing, still fishing, but his greed was so profound that even a whisper of value had brought him running. He saw a chance to turn his joke inheritance into a tidy, unexpected profit. The conversation was a masterclass in manipulation. He spoke of family, of protecting her, of his deep affection for his late Aunt Millie. He painted himself as the savior, the wise patriarch stepping in to rescue his foolish, naive niece from the big, bad world. But Elara heard what he wasn't saying. She heard the frantic avarice, the terror that he had made a mistake, that he had let something valuable slip through his manicured fingers. She thought of Serafina's warning. Do not trust the blood that betrayed you. The words were no longer a historical caution. They were a live wire, humming with present danger. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a slamming door. Marcus blinked. He was not accustomed to that word, especially from her.
I'm sorry.
No, thank you, Marcus, she repeated, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. I'll handle it myself. A flicker of something ugly and hard passed through his eyes before the mask of concern slipped back into place. Elara, be reasonable. You can't possibly. I said no this time. There was no mistaking the steel in her voice. She was no longer asking. She was telling. The dynamic in the room had shifted, irrevocably. He was used to being the one with all the power, all the information. But now she was the one with the secret, and the knowledge of it had changed her. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a cold, righteous anger. This man, who had conspired with her cousins to erase her from their family's legacy, was now here, in her home, trying to trick her out of the one thing that could save her. His betrayal was no longer a past event. It was an active, ongoing assault. He stood up, the polished charm evaporating, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. You're being foolish, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. You have no idea what you're getting into. You'll be ruined. They'll take everything. And when they do, don't come crawling to me for help. I won't, she said, moving to the door and opening it. The message was clear. His face was a mask of fury. He had come expecting to manipulate a mouse and had found a wolf. As he stormed out, he turned in the doorway, his eyes burning with a venomous promise. You'll regret this. You have no idea what you've done. She closed the door on his threat, her hand trembling slightly, but her resolve harder than ever. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side, a faceless corporate entity. On the other, her own greedy, predatory family. Both saw her as an obstacle to be removed. They were two heads of the same hydra. The confrontation had exhausted her, but it had also strengthened her. Marcus's transparent greed had stripped away any lingering sentiment she might have had about family. He had confirmed the wisdom of Serafina's warning and solidified the righteousness of her own cause. She was alone, yes, but she was not weak. She went to the window and watched his silver car speed away, a streak of arrogant light disappearing into the dusk. He thought he was leaving a frightened, foolish woman in his wake. He had no idea. He had just declared war on the custodian of the Millstone Trust, and the custodian was ready to fight back. In the deepest, most meticulously kept ledger, tucked away at the very back of the vault, they found it. It wasn't a financial record, but a manifesto, plan. Serafina, in her final years, had done more than just accumulate and hide her wealth. She had given it a purpose. Page after page, in her steady, forward-slanting script, she laid out her vision for what she called the Serafina Project. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the key that unlocked the moral labyrinth Elara and Mr. Finch had been navigating. Serafina hadn't been running from the sin of the seed money. She had been building a weapon to atone for it. The fortune wasn't a hoard. It was an arsenal. Wealth obtained through injustice cannot be cleansed, she wrote on the first page. It can only be repurposed. Its weight must be turned back against the structures that created it. It must become a corrective force, a counterbalance to the scales that have been tipped for generations. The plans were breathtaking in their scope and detail. She had identified the very families displaced by her husband's land deal, tracking their descendants through the decades. She had researched the systemic barriers they had faced, lack of access to education, to capital, to land ownership. And she had designed a multi-generational strategy to address it. The money was to be placed in a foundation, the Millstone Foundation, a name that now made perfect, chilling sense. Its mission was not charity, which she dismissed in her notes as the salving of the conscience of the rich. Its mission was justice. Restorative justice. The foundation was to fund full scholarships, not just for college but for graduate programs, for medical and law schools, specifically for the descendants of the displaced families. It was to provide seed capital and interest-free loans for Black-owned businesses, creating economic power in communities that had been systematically stripped of it. And in its most audacious goal, it was to begin the process of buying back the original tract of land, piece by piece, at any cost, to be placed in a community trust, forever protected from speculators. The $329 million was not a prize. It was an endowment, the engine for a century-long project of reclamation and empowerment. Reading it, Alara felt the last of her fear and uncertainty fall away, replaced by a profound, awe-inspiring clarity. This was the purpose of the burden. She was not just the inheritor of a fortune. She was the executor of a will, the first director of a project conceived by a ghost. Serafina's eccentricities, her reclusiveness, the construction of the impossible vault. It all snapped into focus. She wasn't a madwoman. She was a strategist of the highest order. She knew that in her time, such a project would have been impossible, the money seized, the plan subverted. So she had buried it, creating a financial time capsule, waiting for a custodian who would live in a world where her vision might just have a chance to succeed. And she had chosen Alara. She wasn't waiting for just anyone, Mr. Finch said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. He looked at Alara across the table, littered with Serafina's papers. She was waiting for you, someone outside the family's circle of greed. Someone who knew what it was to struggle. Someone who would understand the value of this not in dollars, but in lives. The moral dilemma that had tormented Alara was resolved, transformed into a moral imperative. Her fight was no longer for herself or even for Leo. It was for the nameless, faceless families in Serafina's ledgers. It was for the future her great-grandmother had spent a lifetime planning. The knowledge was liberating. It was an armor and a sword. The threats from her uncle and the historical foundation no longer seemed so terrifying. They were obstacles, yes, but they were merely fighting for money. Alara was fighting for a cause. This revelation reshaped their strategy. They were no longer just on the defensive, trying to protect a secret. Now they had a mission to reveal. Their best defense was a moral offense. They began the painstaking legal work of establishing the Millstone Foundation, using Serafina's own detailed charter as their blueprint. Alara was named the chairwoman, Mr. Finch a trustee. They worked with a quiet urgency, knowing that the forces arrayed against them were gathering strength. The foundation's existence, its purpose, would be their shield. It would reframe the narrative from a squabble over a dead woman's money to a fight for justice. It would be harder for their enemies to paint her as a greedy opportunist if she was publicly dedicating the entire fortune to a righteous cause. The work was transformative for Alara. She was no longer just a diner waitress. She was studying foundation law, learning about investment strategies, reading histories of the community Serafina had documented. She was stepping into the role that had been waiting for her, a role she had never imagined for herself. She was becoming the hand that builds. One evening, she took Leo back to the windmill. They didn't go inside. They just sat on a blanket in the tall grass as the sun went down, the sky turning a brilliant, bruised purple. The old stone structure stood silhouetted against the fading light, no longer looking like a tombstone or a ruin. It looked like a sentinel, a guardian. "Your great-great-grandmother built that," Alara told him, her arm around his small shoulders. "She was very smart and very strong. She hid something inside it, something important. Not for us, but for a lot of people who need help, Leo looked from the mill to his mother's face, his expression serious. He didn't understand the details, but he understood the change in her. He could feel the new strength that radiated from her, a quiet, unshakable confidence. "Are you going to help them?" he asked. "Yes, sweetie," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We are." The wind picked up, rustling the grass around them, and for a moment Elara could have sworn she heard a new sound. Not the mournful moan of decay, but a sound like a deep, slow breath. The sound of a sleeping machine, waiting for the order to begin its work. The Serafina project was no longer just a plan on paper. It was a living thing, and she was its heart. The battle was coming, but for the first time Elara was not afraid. She knew exactly what she was fighting for. The opening salvo was fired by Blackwood, Thorne and Associates. A lawsuit was filed, a thick, intimidating document that sought to declare Elara incompetent and appoint the Historical Foundation as the legal conservator of the property and its yet-to-be-appraised contents simultaneously. Marcus filed his own suit, claiming that the deed transfer had been made under false pretenses and that the true value of the estate had been concealed, demanding the sale be nullified. They had formed an unholy, unspoken alliance, their separate legal attacks designed to create a pincer movement to crush her between them. The pressure was immediate and immense. The legal filings were leaked to the press. A local, sensationalist blog picked up the story first. The headline was cruel. "Waitress inherits pile of rocks, sued by family and foundation amid rumors of hidden treasure." They painted her as a greedy, opportunistic child who was cheating her own family. They quoted Marcus extensively, who spoke of his deep concern for his unstable and easily manipulated niece. They included anonymous quotes from family friends who questioned her fitness as a mother, suggesting her sudden obsession with the old mill was a sign of a mental breakdown. It was a character assassination, a classic smear campaign designed to isolate her and turn public opinion against her before the real fight even began. The world that had once been indifferent to her existence was now staring, judging, whispering. Parents at Leo's school looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Her boss at the diner pulled her aside, his face etched with worry, asking if everything was okay. The shield of her anonymity was gone, shattered. Mr. Finch had warned her this would happen. "They're not trying to win in court, not yet," he explained, his office now their official war room. "They're trying to break you before you even get there. They will use the law not as a tool for justice, but as a blunt instrument to batter you into submission." But they had underestimated Elara. They were attacking a woman who no longer existed. The timid, weary waitress had been replaced by the custodian of a legacy. Their attacks, meant to weaken her, only strengthened her resolve. Serafina's purpose was a fire in her belly, burning away the fear. Guided by Mr. Finch, she made her first move. Using a small, carefully chosen set of bearer bonds, liquidated through a discreet Swiss bank that Mr. Finch had a connection with from a case decades ago, she retained her own legal team. She didn't hire a single lawyer. She hired a small, fiercely independent firm known for taking on corporate giants and winning. They were young, hungry, and believed in the story she told them. The central metaphor of the mill became Elara's mantra. What grinds, what is ground, and what remains. Her enemies, the foundation, and her uncle were the grinding stones. They thought she was the grain, the soft, helpless thing to be pulverized between them. They were wrong. She was the foundation stone. She would not be moved. She would endure their grinding, and she would remain. The preliminary hearing was set. It was a procedural step, a chance for the judge to hear the initial arguments and decide if the cases had merit. But everyone knew it was the first true test of strength. The courtroom was small, but it felt like an arena. On one side, a row of expensive suits. The lawyers from Blackwood, Thorne and Associates, and her uncle's legal team, with Marcus himself sitting behind them, his face a mask of smug concern. On the other side, there was only Elara, Mr. Finch, and her lead counsel, a sharp, composed woman named Maria Reyes. Elara felt the weight of 100 gazes on her. She saw the whispers, the condescending glances. They saw a diner waitress in a simple dress, a woman out of her depth. They had no idea who they were facing. The foundation's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and powerful, weaving a narrative of historic preservation and civic duty. He spoke of the covenant, of their mission to protect the state's heritage from private exploitation. Then her uncle's lawyer took the floor, painting a picture of a loving family worried about their vulnerable relative. A woman clearly incapable of managing such a complex historical site. They were building a cage of words around her, defining her, diminishing her. Then it was her turn. Maria Reyes stood, but she didn't begin with legal arguments. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and calm. "Before we address the legal fictions presented by the plaintiffs, my client would like to make a statement." All eyes turned to Alara. She stood, her hands not trembling. She looked directly at the judge, a formidable older woman with a reputation for sharp intellect and little patience for theatrics. "Your Honor," Alara began, her voice steady, "the plaintiffs are correct about one thing. The windmill on my property contains something of significant value. They are wrong about what that value is." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "My great-grandmother, Serafina Washington, did not hide a treasure. She created a tool for justice. She spent her life building a fortune with the express purpose of atoning for a great wrong. A wrong that was perpetrated to create that fortune's seed money. The contents of the windmill are not for me. They are the endowment for a foundation, the Millstone Foundation, whose charter, written by my great-grandmother herself, mandates that every single dollar be used for restorative justice, to fund scholarships, to create economic opportunities, and to reclaim land for the descendants of the very communities that were harmed a century ago." She then turned her gaze from the judge and looked directly at the row of opposing lawyers, and then at her uncle. Her voice dropped, but it carried a new weight, the weight of undeniable moral authority. "The plaintiffs are not here to preserve history. They are here to repeat it. They are here to take, once again, what was meant to restore. They are not fighting me, a waitress. They are fighting my great-grandmother's last will and testament. They are fighting against the very idea of justice." She sat down. The courtroom was utterly silent. She hadn't just presented a defense. She had dropped a bomb. She had seized control of the narrative, transforming the case from a sordid squabble over money into a public moral referendum. The Foundation's lawyers were stunned. Her uncle's face was a mottled red, a mixture of fury and shock. They had come to grind her down, to define her as small and incompetent. Instead, she had defined them, casting them as the villains in a story much larger and more profound than they had ever imagined. The judge looked down at the documents, then over her glasses at Alara, a new, sharp interest in her eyes. The grinding of the stones had begun, but the foundation was shaking. The aftermath of Alara's statement in court was a seismic shift. The narrative she had so powerfully claimed was now the story. Local news outlets, and soon national ones, picked up on the incredible tale. The hidden fortune, the tale of historic injustice, and the single mother determined to use her inheritance to right a century-old wrong. Reporters who had previously written condescendingly about the waitress with a windfall now framed her as a figure of immense moral strength. The Millstone Foundation, once a legal strategy, became a public cause. The story of Serafina Washington, the brilliant, secretive black woman who had built a financial weapon against injustice, captured the public imagination. She was no longer a footnote in a family history. She was a historical figure, a visionary. The legal positions of the Historical Foundation and Marcus began to crumble, not under legal pressure, but under the immense weight of public opinion. The Foundation, which traded on its reputation as a benevolent preserver of history, now looked like a greedy corporation trying to seize funds meant for restorative justice. Their wealthy donors became uneasy. Phone calls were made. Their carefully constructed public image was cracking. Marcus faced a similar implosion. His attempt to portray himself as a concerned patriarch was shattered. He was now seen for what he was, a man trying to swindle his own niece out of a legacy dedicated to racial justice. His business partners grew distant. His social standing, the thing he valued above all else, was tarnished. In the cold, hard light of Alara's truth, their greed looked ugly and indefensible. Their legal teams, sensing the shifting tides, advised them to settle. But Alara, guided by Mr. Finch, refused. Settling implies they have a legitimate claim, she said. They don't. This isn't a negotiation. It's a reclamation. She would accept nothing less than a full public withdrawal of their lawsuits. Faced with a protracted, embarrassing, and likely losing public battle, they folded. One by one, the lawsuits were dropped. The letters of withdrawal were sterile, legal documents, but to Alara, they were declarations of surrender. Her uncle disappeared from her life, a disgraced figure who had lost not only the fortune but also his reputation. The Historical Foundation issued a quiet, face-saving press release about respecting the charitable intentions of the original owner and retreated back into the shadows. Alara had won, but the victory felt less like a celebration and more like the quiet, solemn end of a long and brutal war. There were no parties, no triumphant headlines in her mind. There was only the immense, quiet weight of the work that was now ahead of her. The final section of the story begins not in a courtroom, but on the land in front of the windmill. Alara stood with Leo, Mr. Finch beside her, looking at the old stone sentinel. It was a cool autumn day, and the wind, the same wind that had once sounded so mournful, now seemed to whisper of possibilities. It was no longer a ruin. It was a monument, a headquarters. The first official act of the Millstone Foundation was a press conference, held right there, on the grass in front of the mill. Alara, no longer in her waitress uniform but in a simple, professional dress, stood at a podium and spoke. She didn't talk about her legal victory or her family's betrayal. She spoke about Serafina. She told the story of the displaced families. And she announced the Foundation's first initiatives. A full scholarship program, named for Serafina Washington, for students of color pursuing degrees in law, finance, and urban planning, and a grant program to provide capital for new businesses in historically underserved communities. The journey from that first insulting letter to this moment had been a trial by fire. Alara had been forced to confront the ghosts of the past, the greed of the present, and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. She had been betrayed, attacked, and underestimated. But through it all, she had held onto the purpose Serafina had entrusted to her. She had been the hand that builds. In the months that followed, the foundation came to life. They hired a small, dedicated staff. The first Serafina Washington scholars were chosen, their hopeful, brilliant faces a testament to a legacy finally fulfilled. The foundation's investment in a community-led development project broke ground, turning a blighted urban lot into a new center for commerce and culture. Alara was no longer serving coffee. She was chairing board meetings, reviewing grant proposals, and speaking to community leaders. She was wielding the power of Serafina's fortune not as a weapon of vengeance, but as a tool of creation. She had found her calling, not in the discovery of the money, but in the discovery of its purpose. One evening, as dusk settled over the countryside, she stood alone before the windmill. The structure had been stabilized, the roof repaired, the windows replaced. It was not a museum piece, but a working office, the symbolic and literal heart of the foundation. A soft light glowed from within. As she watched, something incredible happened. A breeze, stronger than the rest, swept across the field. It caught the old, repaired spars of the windmill's blades. With a deep, resonant groan of wood and metal waking from a long slumber, the blades began to turn. Slowly at first, then with a steady, powerful grace, they spun against the darkening sky. A century of stillness had been broken. The machine was working again. It was no longer grinding grain into flour, but injustice into opportunity, despair into hope. Alara watched, a slow smile spreading across her face, tears welling in her eyes. The wind was turning. The world was changing. And in the heart of it all stood a woman who had been given a crumbling ruin and had used it to rebuild a future. She was the daughter of a forgotten legacy, the mother of a hopeful future, and the steadfast custodian of the Millstone Trust. A quiet, powerful force, turning, always turning, in the direction of the light.